What would you do if a baby with no note, no explanation, was suddenly left on your doorstep? A tiny life placed solely in your hands. That's precisely what unfolded for Margaret Coleman. Over 2.5 decades later, the little girl she embraced has blossomed into a tenacious woman, driven by a vision to transform lives. Together, they're poised to reshape a heartbreaking beginning into an extraordinary narrative of hope and family. You won't believe how this mother-daughter team converted a twist of fate into an enduring legacy. Before we delve into this poignant tale, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and make sure to hit that subscribe button. That evening, the house was hushed, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. Margaret Coleman, a 50-year-old woman whose face bore the marks of many years, sat in her humble Richmond, Virginia home. It had been a demanding day at the small community center where she assisted families navigating difficult circumstances. Her heart often ached for those she encountered daily, but tonight she yearned for a moment of quiet peace. Or so she thought. A sudden, sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the stillness, sending a jolt through her. Margaret furrowed her brow. It was well past 10 p.m. Who could possibly be at her door at this hour? Her hand hesitated before reaching for the doorknob. No sounds echoed from outside, no shadows stirred beneath the streetlights. With a cautious breath, she slowly opened the door, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. And there she was, a minuscule bundle swaddled in a faded white sheet resting right at her doorstep. Margaret's heart seized. Her mind raced, struggling to comprehend the sight. Baby. Pale, delicate, and impossibly small, lying still save for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Tiny fingers peeked from the folds of the sheet, and wisps of light hair framed her flushed cheeks. Margaret felt a tightness in her throat. Kneeling, she gently lifted the child into her arms. The baby was feather-light, barely registering in Margaret's grasp, yet in that instant, it felt as though the entire world had been entrusted to her. The child's eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting Margaret's gaze for the very first time. In that second, Margaret felt an inexplicable shift deep within her. There was no note, no explanation, no hint of who might have left the baby or why. The street outside was deserted, save for a few distant parked cars. Margaret stood there for a moment, cradling the baby against her chest, feeling the soft rhythm of her breathing. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She knew the answer. Her first instinct was to contact social services. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, she couldn't bring herself to dial. The thought of this child being shunted into a system, potentially lost in a maze of paperwork and strangers, twisted a knot in her stomach. She'd witnessed it far too often. Margaret gazed down at the baby again. The child was quiet, peaceful, as if she already implicitly trusted Margaret. The woman gently brushed her fingers across the baby's soft cheek, feeling her warmth. "I can't let you go," she whispered. Margaret carried the baby inside, her mind swirling with possibilities. She knew she wasn't prepared for this. Her life hadn't unfolded as planned, and the dream of having her own family had been buried long ago. An illness in her late 30s had stripped away her chances of motherhood. But this felt like a second chance. The next day, Margaret contacted the authorities. They arrived, asked their questions, but no one could ascertain the child's origin or who might have abandoned her. There were no missing child reports matching the baby's description. It was as if she had simply materialized. After several weeks of communication with social services, Margaret made a life-altering decision. She would keep the baby. She would adopt her. The process was lengthy, punctuated by moments of doubt, but with each passing day, Margaret became more certain that this child was meant to be with her. She named her Sarah. The initial years were demanding. Margaret had no prior experience raising a child, and the abrupt transition from a quiet routine to sleepless nights and constant worry was at times overwhelming. Yet there was also profound joy in the laughter that filled her home, joy in the tiny footsteps that trailed her everywhere, joy in the simple act of holding Sarah close when she cried. Margaret's friends questioned her choice. "You're 50, they would say. Are you sure you're ready for this?" But Margaret knew she was ready, perhaps not in the way they intended, but in her heart she was more prepared than ever before. This was her purpose. Sarah was a bright, inquisitive child. She grew up without questioning why her skin differed from her mother's. To her, Margaret was her mother, and that was all that truly mattered. They lived a simple life in Richmond, where Margaret continued her work at the community center, helping families who faced the very struggles she understood intimately. The years passed, and Sarah blossomed into a kind and compassionate young woman. She had inherited Margaret's profound empathy and often volunteered at shelters and orphanages. Margaret watched her with immense pride, knowing that despite the hurdles they had faced, they had forged a life together. A family bound by love, not by blood. It was a warm summer afternoon when Sarah, now 26, sat across from Margaret in the small kitchen they had shared for as long as she could remember. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the worn table where countless meals had been shared. Margaret, now 76, moved a little slower these days, but her spirit remained as vibrant as ever. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Sarah began, her voice hesitant but resolute. Margaret looked up from her cup of tea, sensing something significant was about to be said. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes meeting her mother's. "I want to open a children's home." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't anticipated this. "A children's home?" Sarah nodded. "For kids who've been abandoned or lost. Kids like me. I want to give them a place where they feel safe, where they know they're loved just like you did for me." Margaret felt a lump form in her throat. She had always known Sarah possessed a special heart, but hearing these words filled her with a profound mix of pride and awe. Sarah continued, her voice softening, "And I want you to help me run it." Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Me? Oh, Sarah, I'm not sure I—" "Please, Mom," Sarah interrupted, reaching across the table to take Margaret's hands in hers. "You've always wanted a big family. I know you never had the chance because of what happened. But you gave me a family. Now I want us to do this together. You and me helping these kids. You could be like a mother to them too." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. She had rarely spoken of her own unfulfilled dream of a large family, but Sarah had always known. And now, here she was, offering Margaret the opportunity to realize that dream in a way she had never imagined. I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Say yes," Sarah said, her smile soft but brimming with hope. "We can do this together." Margaret sat for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. She had always felt Sarah was a gift, an unexpected blessing that had filled the void in her life. And now, after all these years, Sarah was giving her another gift, one that would allow her to impact even more lives. She squeezed Sarah's hands, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's do it." Coleman's Hope, the children's home, opened in a small town outside Richmond. It wasn't easy. Challenges arose with funding, bureaucratic hurdles, and the emotional toll of caring for children who had endured so much. But through it all, Margaret and Sarah stood firm. Margaret found herself re-energized by the work. Though her body moved slower, her heart was full. Each child who walked through their doors became part of their expanding family, and Margaret loved them as if they were her own. Sarah, too, thrived in her role, becoming a beacon of hope for the children, offering them the same compassion and care Margaret had once given her. Together they built something beautiful, something that would endure long after they were gone. One evening, after the children were all tucked into bed, Margaret and Sarah sat together on the porch of the home, watching the sun dip below the fields. The air was warm and cicadas hummed softly in the distance. "I never thought I'd have this," Margaret said quietly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "A family like this." Sarah smiled, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. "You always had a family, Mom. You had me." Margaret placed a gentle hand on Sarah's head, her heart swelling with love. "And I'll always have you." As the sun vanished below the horizon, bathing the world in a golden glow, Margaret closed her eyes and savored the moment. She had spent her life seeking purpose, meaning, and now she knew she had found it. Not just in the children she had helped, but in the daughter who had saved her just as much as she had saved that tiny baby on her doorstep all those years ago. Margaret and Sarah's journey didn't end there. It continued with every new child who found their way to Coleman's Hope. A journey of love, second chances, and building a family bound not by blood, but by the deepest kind of affection. As the years progressed, Coleman's Hope evolved from a small, humble abode into a thriving sanctuary for children in need. What began as a few rooms became a bustling center, thanks to the tireless dedication of Sarah and Margaret. The surrounding community rallied in support, recognizing the extraordinary work these two women were doing. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and the home became a guiding light for the town. Margaret, now in her 80s, had slowed down considerably. Her body ached from years of tireless work, but her heart was more vibrant than ever. Every child who passed through Coleman's Hope found in Margaret a wellspring of warmth and wisdom. Her once small and quiet home was now filled with the laughter and chatter of children, just as she had always dreamed. However, challenges were inevitable. One autumn, the home faced its toughest test yet. A sudden economic downturn caused funding to dwindle, donations dried up, and soon they found themselves struggling to keep the doors open. Sarah worked tirelessly to secure new funding sources, but the stress was overwhelming. Margaret, witnessing the burden on her daughter's shoulders, felt a familiar pang in her heart. She had always prided herself on being the strong one, the one who could shoulder the world's weight. But now it was Sarah who had embraced that role. Margaret could only watch as her daughter, now in her 50s, juggled the demands of running the home with the escalating financial strain. One evening, as they sat in the office reviewing the numbers, Sarah let out a deep sigh. "I don't know if we can make it through this," she admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Margaret reached over and placed a hand on Sarah's. "We will," she said firmly. "We've come too far to give up now." Sarah looked up at her mother, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But how? We're barely staying afloat." Margaret smiled softly. "Because we've been through worse, haven't we? And every time we've emerged stronger. This is just another challenge, and we'll face it as we always have, together." Sarah's eyes welled with tears and she nodded. "You're right, Mom. We'll find a way." Sarah's determination never wavered. She reached out to everyone she knew, organizing fundraising events, speaking at local community centers, and even approaching local businesses for support. Slowly, word spread, and soon the town began to rally around Coleman's Hope once again. One day, as Sarah was preparing to speak at a fundraising event, a surprise visitor arrived. An older man, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit, stood at the door. His face was familiar, though Sarah couldn't immediately place him. He smiled warmly, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Miss Coleman?" he asked, his voice smooth and polite. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, intrigued. The man extended his hand. "I'm Greg Franklin. I was once a resident here about 20 years ago." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Greg Franklin. I remember you. You were just a boy when you were here." Greg smiled. "That's right. And I've never forgotten this place. You and your mother, you changed my life. I arrived here with nothing and you gave me a home, a chance when no one else would." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She had known countless children over the years, and it was moments like this that reinforced the profound purpose of their work. "It was our honor, Greg. I'm so glad to see you again." Greg's smile broadened. "I heard about the difficulties you're facing and I wanted to help." Before Sarah could respond, Greg pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "It's not much, but I hope it helps keep Coleman's Hope running for a long time." Sarah opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was a check for $50,000. Her hands trembled as she looked back at Greg, tears springing to her eyes. "Greg, I don't know what to say." Greg shrugged modestly. "You don't have to say anything. You saved my life when I was just a kid. It's the least I could do." Sarah wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Greg nodded and gave her a warm hug before departing, promising to stay in touch. As Sarah watched him walk away, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The home had given so much to so many children, and now one of them had returned to give back. As the years advanced, Coleman's Hope continued to flourish, thanks to the love and dedication of Sarah and Margaret, as well as the unwavering support of the community. The children who came through their doors were more than just residents. They were family. Margaret, though now in her late 80s, remained the heart of the home. Children adored her, flocking to her for comfort, stories, and wisdom. She had become a grandmother to them all, and they cherished her deeply. One evening, as Sarah sat with Margaret on the front porch, they reflected on the journey they had shared. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the landscape. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" Margaret said softly, her voice filled with nostalgia. Sarah nodded. "Have. And we've built something beautiful here." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling with pride. You've accomplished more than I ever could have dreamed, Sarah. I'm so proud of you. Sarah looked at her mother, her heart swelling with love. I couldn't have done it without you. You're the one who showed me what it means to love, to care for others. You're the reason Coleman's hope exists. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You gave me a family when I thought I'd never have one. And now you've given me a bigger family than I ever could have imagined. Sarah leaned over and hugged her mother tightly. I love you, Mom. I always will. I love you too, sweetheart. As they sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. She had spent her life searching for meaning, for family, and now she realized she had found it, not just in Sarah, but in every child who had walked through the doors of Coleman's Hope. Her legacy was one of love, and it would endure long after she was gone. Years later, Sarah found herself sitting in the same spot on the porch, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her sat a young boy no older than 6, his legs swinging off the edge of the step. Miss Sarah? He asked, his voice small and curious. Yes, sweetheart. Do you think I'll have a family one day? Sarah smiled warmly at the boy, her heart swelling with compassion. She had been asked this question many times before by many different children, but the answer was always the same. You already do, she said softly. You're part of Coleman's Hope, and that means you have a family right here. We're all in this together, and we'll always be here for you. The boy smiled, his worries easing. He scooted closer to Sarah, resting his head against her arm. Thanks, Miss Sarah. You're welcome, sweetheart. As they sat together, watching the sun set once again over the fields, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had carried on her mother's legacy, and now, a new generation was part of the family they had built together. And so the story of Coleman's Hope continued. It was a story of love, of second chances, and of building a family that extended beyond blood. Margaret's dream had become a reality, and Sarah had taken that dream and expanded it even further. The home would continue to welcome children in need, offering them a place of safety, love, and hope. And in the hearts of every child who walked through those doors, Margaret's love would live on forever. The seasons continued their cycle, and life at Coleman's Hope progressed with a steady rhythm. Margaret, now nearing her 90s, spent more time in her chair on the porch, observing the children playing in the garden or riding their bikes along the driveway. Though her body was fragile, her spirit remained robust, sustained by the love that enveloped her. One crisp fall afternoon, Sarah sat beside her mother on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. They had settled into a quiet routine, the kind that only emerges after decades of shared experiences and unspoken understanding. There was no need for words. The bond they shared spoke volumes. Do you ever wonder, Mom? Sarah began, breaking the peaceful silence. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me on that doorstep? Margaret slowly turned her head to look at her daughter. Her eyes, though tired and etched with age, still held that familiar glimmer of love. I try not to think about what could have been. What matters is what did happen. Sarah smiled softly, acknowledging her mother's wisdom. It just amazes me sometimes how everything turned out. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. Life is funny like that. You can't predict it, and you certainly can't control it. But sometimes when you least expect it, it gives you exactly what you need. Sarah reached over and gently squeezed her mother's hand. She had always admired her mother's strength, her resilience in the face of so many challenges. Margaret had endured a life of loss, loneliness, and missed opportunities, yet she had never allowed it to break her. Instead, she had poured her heart into Sarah and into every child who passed through the doors of their home. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the leaves dance in the wind. The children played in the yard, their laughter filling the air, a constant reminder of the life Margaret had built. And though Margaret's body was weak, her heart swelled with pride, knowing that the legacy she and Sarah had created would continue long after she was gone. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow across the horizon, Margaret closed her eyes. I'm tired, Sarah, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah looked over at her mother, her heart constricting with the weight of those words. I know, Mom, she replied, her own voice thick with emotion. Margaret took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly. I'm ready, she said softly. I've had a good life. I've loved and I've been loved. That's all I ever wanted. Sarah felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, knowing her mother wouldn't want her to cry. "I love you, Mom. I always will." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. The world around them faded into the background, and all that remained was the quiet, unspoken bond between mother and daughter. "I love you too, Sarah," Margaret whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. And with that, Margaret closed her eyes one final time, her hand still held tightly in Sarah's. The weeks following Margaret's passing were a blur for Sarah. The home continued to function as it always had. Children played, meals were served, and life went on. But for Sarah, everything felt different. The absence of her mother was palpable, like a missing piece of her heart. The funeral had been a simple affair, just as Margaret had wished. Close friends, former residents of Coleman's Hope, and community members gathered to pay their respects. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and Margaret's life was celebrated as one of purpose and love. But for Sarah, there was no replacing her mother. Margaret had been her rock, her guide, and her greatest source of strength. Without her, Sarah felt adrift, unsure of how to move forward. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the office, poring over paperwork for the home, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a young woman standing in the doorway, her face hesitant but kind. "Miss Coleman?" the young woman asked, her voice soft. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, setting down her pen. The woman stepped forward, holding a small envelope in her hand. "I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to give you this. It's a letter from my mother. She was one of the children who lived here many years ago." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had received many letters from former residents over the years, but each one was a reminder of the profound impact Coleman's Hope had on so many lives. She accepted the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. The letter inside was brief but heartfelt. "Dear Sarah, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the children your mother took in many years ago. I just wanted to let you know that because of your mother I was able to go on to live a good life. I have a family of my own now, and I think of her often, especially when I look at my children. She gave me hope when I had none, and for that I will always be grateful. Please know that her legacy lives on in all of us who were lucky enough to be part of her family. Thank you for continuing her work and for giving so many of us the chance to build better lives. I hope you find comfort in knowing that your mother made a difference in this world. With love, a grateful daughter." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she read the words. She had always known her mother's impact was profound, but seeing it in writing like this brought a fresh wave of emotion. Margaret had touched so many lives, more than she ever could have known. After a few moments, Sarah folded the letter and placed it gently on her desk. She wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Her mother was gone, but her legacy wasn't. Coleman's Hope would continue just as it always had. It would remain a place of love, of healing, and of second chances. And Sarah would carry on her mother's work, knowing that she wasn't alone. Margaret's spirit would always be with her. In every child who walked through those doors, in every life that was changed for the better. As the years went by, Coleman's Hope continued to grow. Sarah, now in her 60s, became a well-respected figure in the community, known not just for her work at the home but for the compassion and love she extended to everyone she met. The children's home expanded, thanks to the generosity of former residents and community members who believed in its mission. A new wing was added, providing even more space for children who needed a safe place to call home. The staff grew, and Sarah was able to step back from some of the day-to-day responsibilities, though she remained deeply involved in the lives of the children. On the anniversary of Margaret's passing, a special ceremony was held at the home. Former residents from all over the country came to pay their respects and share stories of how Margaret had transformed their lives. It was a day filled with laughter, tears, and cherished memories, an outpouring of love for the woman who had dedicated her life to helping others. As the sun set on that day, Sarah stood in the garden, looking out over the grounds that had become her life's work. She thought of her mother, of the night she had found her on the doorstep, and of the journey they had undertaken together. A sense of peace settled over her. Margaret's dream had become a reality, and it had blossomed into something even grander than either of them could have imagined. The home was thriving, and it would continue to do so for generations to come. Sarah smiled, feeling the warmth of her mother's love surrounding her. She had done it. They had done it, together. Years later, when Sarah finally retired, Coleman's hope was entrusted to the capable hands of the next generation. Young leaders, many of whom had once been children in the home, took over, carrying forward the legacy that Margaret and Sarah had built. Sarah spent her retirement traveling, writing, and visiting the home whenever she could. She never lost touch with the children, always finding ways to stay connected to the place that had defined her life. On one particularly beautiful spring day, as Sarah sat on a bench in the garden, watching the children play, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and sometimes difficult, but it had been worth every step. She closed her eyes, the sounds of laughter filling her ears, and smiled. Margaret's dream had not only come true but it had flourished. And Sarah knew that wherever her mother was, she was smiling too.